Hey everybody. Well, today is a sad day in the world of comics. Oh, by the way, I feel I should mention you are watching Comics Corner. Haha. Anyways, yeah, it's a sad day in the comics world. Vertigo, a DC imprint which was launched in 1993, is officially dead. And by that I mean it's essentially been liquidated. It's going to be reshuffled into the lineup. The titles are going to kind of still exist, but at the same time, it's basically going to be replaced by Black Label. And that also, now the good news is that by 2020, uh, it will actually, the books that are, currently in progress are either going to end or they're going to be transferred over to DC's Black Label, imprint. But at the same time, I'm not really a big fan of the whole divisions of comics, like DC Zoom, and DC Inc. Now the idea is that they're gonna basically put age themed labels now. Black Label will be the 17 and above. DC will be the regular plain DC is going to be for 13 and above, and then they've got DC Kids. I have no problem labeling comics for kids, but I also don't really think that it is. It's just kind of hard to put into words that it doesn't really need to exist, but it's an interesting idea, I guess. Now the good news is that it is going to end. That some imprints and some things like Warren Ellis's The Wildstorm is actually not going to end. It's going to continue to exist, which I actually am really happy with because I actually liked The Wildstorm, what I've read of it so far, and I like Warren Ellis as a writer. But this is actually kind of talking about Vertigo. Now, Vertigo, for those of you who don't know, it was the brand primarily responsible for a lot of, characters getting a lot of, side comics. It was almost kind of a competitor with Image for a time. Such titles included Lucifer and Constantine, the Sandman by Neil Gaiman, some stuff regarding Doom Patrol, which has actually made a comeback in its own way with a new TV show, so there's that. Swamp Thing. There was a lot of, comics that came out of DC's Vertigo. Now, I haven't read a lot of them, granted, but if, you are a big fan of, like, the Sandman in particular, or John Constantine, aka the Hellblazer, which I am, Vertigo is a name that, was kind of familiar to a lot of us as comics fans. So what happened? Well, a lot of things happened. I think I can actually point kind of the downfall to the fact that the original editor of the imprint, Karen Berger, the founder of it, actually, announced that in 2012 she would be stepping down from the company. And in the process, she at least did name a successor in the form of Shelley Bond, who had been editing since, the beginning of the imprint. However, DC in 2016 basically absorbed Vertigo. They basically did away with a lot of Vertigo's properties and shelved them in 2016. And in the process, they also eliminated Shelley Bond's position. And then from there on out, it was a hot potato game between a couple of new people in charge of Vertigo until 2018 of last year, almost a year ago. It was a very interesting idea because Vertigo, in their 2018 relaunch, was focusing on a lot of titles that I personally didn't see myself reading. I wouldn't say that I didn't see the value in them, but I didn't see myself reading them. At the same time, I understand why some people might want to read them. The problem was that said titles, a lot of them felt like they were relying very heavily on the Neil Gaiman Sandman's mythos. You had a new imprint of Lucifer, The House of Whispers, The Dreaming, and Books of Magic. And then you had new series that were announced a couple months later, and with 3 of them actually due to begin, were set to begin earlier this year. Unfortunately, a lot of these books are going to end. And in fact, some of them actually didn't even make it past 6 issues. Border Town, which, judging by the title and what little I read of the synopses, is about immigration or something to that degree. Correct me if I'm wrong. That was canceled after 6 issues, 2 of which were unpublished. Hex Wives ended after 6 issues. And then Second Coming was canceled before its debut issue. Now, some of the other books from this launch are still, at least as of this recording, they are at least somewhat, like they're on the fence as to whether or not they'll continue or wrap up their run. American Carnage, High Level, Second Coming, and Goddess Mode. Now, Goddess Mode you may have heard of. The rest of these might have actually kind of faded away. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Zoe Quinn is involved in Goddess Mode. Now, I'm not going to get into a Gamergate spiel about Zoe Quinn and, whether she was, she used, whether she's a good game developer, a bad game developer, whether she used her relationships to garner good press or not. What I will say is that she doesn't have the greatest ethical track record. In fact, part of the problem I actually had with Zoe Quinn actually sprung up from Vertigo, because recently, earlier this year, an interview on The Verge was actually done by a friend of Zoe Quinn's who refused to disclose that they were, cordially friends beyond, the friendly nature of, interviewer / writer and, interviewee, which, as a journalist, I find very offensive. It's like, I know that part of it's not Zoe Quinn's fault, but at the same time, for Zoe Quinn to not acknowledge that, this person was unethical and how they, not that they said anything bad about them, just that they weren't ethical in disclosing, their things. But that's a completely different rant. Goddess Mode is one of those titles that's hanging in limbo. I honestly don't know if I ever want to read it. Part of me does, because I don't know why, but even when I talk about, like certain writers and creators, I'm actually still kind of intrigued to read their writing. Kind of like with Frank Miller or Rob Liefeld. I may not always get what they're trying to do, and I may not always like it, but I definitely want to maybe see where they go from here on out. By the way, a couple of other Vertigo titles that I actually forgot to mention. Animal Man by Grant Morrison. Very good title. I actually really would like to read, more of that someday. iZombie, which actually got made into a TV show, so, there's that at least. Preacher, Garth Ennis, something of, interest for... So, I mean, there's a lot of, books from this imprint. Now, like I said, DC owns a lot of the characters. In fact, they own pretty much everything because it's an imprint. And for those of you who don't know what an imprint is in comic book lingo, an imprint essentially means that it is a it's an offshoot. It's a publishing. It's essentially it's a different brand name that the company uses for publishing. For lack of a better term. Um, Honestly, I don't know if I lament Vertigo's death as much as I say, like, did Malibu Studios or some of the other studios that kind of fell by the wayside in the 90s and into the 90s. I think that if Image Comics and Dark Horse weren't doing a lot of what Vertigo, right now, what Vertigo did in the 90s, I'd actually feel a lot more pain at their loss. But the thing is that there are so many companies right now vying for attention that Vertigo as an imprint probably was not meant to last, even with the new titles. And kind of to get back to the title lineup from that relaunch, which, by the way, those were the only books that were being made. The Neil Gaiman stuff and then those brand new creator titles. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm happy that Vertigo wanted to actually give some creators the opportunity to play around with certain topics that maybe Marvel or main brand DC wouldn't let them touch. But at the same time, there is a reason why these titles failed, and it's not because people, are kind of afraid of diversity in the comics world. It's that they're kind of sick of it. It's kind of the same thing with people when it comes to films and, television and whatnot. It's not that people don't want to embrace diversity a lot of the times, I find, or, have these, controversial subjects, brought up in their escapist medium. They're sick and tired of it being a mandatory requirement that everything be about an issue, and a political one at that kind of touches on a hot button issue when you're really just trying to read something for the sake of escaping from that atmosphere. I don't know. I could be wrong. But a lot of, again, the synopses, they dealt with things like illegal immigration, LGBTQ issues, things that are okay to talk about and they're okay to write comics about. I'm just saying the market may not always be there. And I think the problem is the market for a lot of those issues isn't directly there. I think a lot of people, don't mind when these things, come up as character arcs or the like, but when they're deliberately put in as the background fabric of somebody, of a character, of a story, people just tend to lose interest because, they see it every day and therefore they want something different. They want something escape related. Again, I could be very much wrong. This is mostly just me lamenting the death of Vertigo and how, as an imprint, again, it's not something that I read to the greatest degree. And now that it's, officially kind of dead and buried, I might actually find myself picking up more as time goes on. But I honestly can say without a doubt that, anytime a comic publisher or an imprint goes under, it's bad for business because a lot of good people are now forced to scramble for other work. And, it's a shame that it had to happen essentially twice because Vertigo was pretty much on life support as of 2016. And when it got that jolt in the arm in 2018, I think a lot of people were hopeful. Maybe the title lineup didn't, sound intriguing to some people, but at least people were hopeful that this could be a nice alternative brand, again, for something creator owned. Another Image Comics or Dark Horse, where a lot of these creators are given a bit more leeway and control than they are in mainline Marvel and DC. And that is something I can always support and get behind. It just was not meant to be in this time or in this era, apparently. In any event, I'd like to thank you all for listening to me ramble a little bit. I know this video is probably going to be coming out of left field for those of you, few of you who have subscribed to me or may subscribe to me in the future as a, kind of a weird retrospective. And I know I probably rambled and didn't make a whole lot of sense to some. But in any event, I hope that all of you have a nice day, And thank you for listening to Comics Corner.